In this video, we're going to talk about market structure and competition. Economists use market structure theory to understand how firms compete in markets. In a market structure defined by perfect competition, there's an infinite number of sellers selling an identical product, and there are no barriers to firms entering or exiting a market. In this scenario, you're going to have complete or extreme competition. And in the long run, there will be no economic profits. Now, the benefit for consumers in this situation, where you have perfect or extreme competition, is the end result is the greatest output and the lowest prices. Another market structure is monopoly. And in a sense, monopoly is the opposite of competition because you have only one seller. And in fact, they're selling a differentiated product and there are barriers to entry. In this situation, because there are barriers to entry, there's no competition. New firms cannot enter and compete with the monopolist when they're making economic profits. So the monopolist is able to make economic profits in the long run. The end result of this for consumers is that they pay higher prices for a lesser or lower output. A third type of market structure is imperfect or monopolistic competition. In this type of market structure, there are no barriers to entry or exit. So in the short run, firms can make an economic profit, but they can't make an economic profit in the long run. And in this sense, imperfect competition is like perfect competition. But firms in this marketplace don't have to sell an identical product. In fact, they differentiate their products on quality, on price, and on marketing. And firms in imperfect competition spend a lot of time investing in new products and innovations in order to have products that are differentiated from competitors. In the long run, firms in imperfect competition cannot make economic profits. The fourth type of market structure is oligopoly. In an oligopoly, if you only have a few sellers and you have barriers to entry and exit, then the few sellers can make an agreement. They can collude in an attempt to act like one monopoly, where they restrict output and charge higher prices. They do this because they're able to make economic profits in the long run. And the idea is they could share or split those economic profits that they make in the long run. So an oligopolist tries to make an exclusive agreement and act like one monopoly. The fact is that once these exclusive agreements are made, both firms have an incentive to break the exclusive agreements. So the cartels with exclusive agreements are not stable. And in the long run, firms in oligopoly will wind up breaking the agreements and competing with each other. Here's a summary of the four types of market structure and the important characteristics. And remember, in monopoly, there are barriers to entry and exit, and firms are able to make an economic profit in the long run. In perfect competition and monopolistic competition, or imperfect competition, there is no barriers to entry and exit. And as a result, firms cannot make an economic profit in the long run. Now, when it comes to perfect competition and monopoly, oftentimes we start to see the world in these terms. And we have to be a little bit careful because it's much more complex than this. It's not the case where things are either all monopolies or all perfect competitions. And what's important about this is that the dynamics of the market process cause the firms to shift and to move. So they might be a monopoly at one point and then facing competition at another point. And so perfect competition and monopoly are just models that help us understand reality, but they aren't really a description of reality. So we have to be careful that we don't um, relying too heavily on the models and wind up having a flawed view of competition works. If you look at antitrust policy in the United States, I think this is a good example of relying too much on the models. The antitrust laws and the antitrust policy rely very heavily on the number of firms and profitability, meaning if there's only one or not many firms, and one has most of the market share and they are profitable, they look at them as a monopoly, and they spend less time focusing on barriers to entry and exit and substitutes, which are also important items when it comes to understanding market structure. Now, entry and exit are the most important features of market structure theory. And really, perfect competition and competition in general depends upon freedom of entry and exit. It depends upon there being no barriers to entry and exit. And similarly, monopoly depends upon there being barriers to entry and exit. So barriers to entry and exit winds up being the key feature of market structure theory, and really the thing you have to focus in on the most when you're trying to analyze companies in competition. We can look at market structure as really a continuum. You have perfect competition or complete competition on one side, you have the absence of competition or monopoly on the other side, and firms exist somewhere along this continuum between perfect competition and monopoly. In fact, if we were to put some more detail into the continuum, you'd see that we have we can build in the barriers to entry. So where there's no barriers to entry, we have perfect competition and imperfect competition. And perfect competition is probably more complete competition than imperfect competition. And I've added a few here. You might have something that's closer to perfect competition, but not quite perfect competition, and closer to imperfect competition, but not quite imperfect competition. So again, you have this continuum. Now, in the areas where you have barriers to entry and exit, you can either have one firm where it's a monopoly, or maybe a few firms competing or colluding, and that's an oligopoly. And so we have a kind of a more rich description here of the market structure theory that includes our four market structure types and a little bit more detail. Now, one of the important things to know about oligopoly, for example, is there has to be a barrier to entry for there to be an oligopoly, similar to monopoly. So just having a few firms competing in a marketplace does not make it an oligopoly. It can only be an oligopoly and therefore have the potential for collusion if there's a barrier to entry. So we also know that oftentimes there aren't really barriers to entry, and in most cases there aren't barriers to entry. So if that's the case, then firms really exist somewhere along a continuum of competition, where you might have extreme competition or perfect competition on the one side, and then rivalrous competition or strong competition on the other. And if you notice here, we've already assumed there's no barriers to entry, so all that's left really is less differentiation or more differentiation, and firms will be on this continuum of competition where they're either at perfect competition or imperfect competition, or maybe somewhere in between and closer to one versus the other. Now, one of the things about market structure theory, which oftentimes is left out, and I think that is one of the shortcomings of traditional market structure theory, is the importance of the entrepreneur. We know that the entrepreneur is the one who organizes the factors of production, who takes risk, and is the one who starts new ventures, new ideas, and new business processes. And when you look at market structure theory, oftentimes we're looking at just a slice in time, and the role of the entrepreneur, which plays out over time, in the market process is not given enough importance or enough significance. This is also true with substitutions. If you in traditional market structure theory, there's not really enough emphasis or enough importance put on the fact that everything has a substitute. And it's true that in competition, it's not just a matter of identical products competing with each other, but oftentimes consumers will substitute one thing for another that really aren't alike at all, but they provide the same function, and they're treated as if they were substantially similar by consumers. And that's the important thing about substitution. So I think again, we have to be careful that we understand how important substitution is in the competitive process, and not ignore it or underestimate the importance of substitution. Now, Michael Porter's work on competition is largely based on market structure theory, including his article, his Harvard Business School article, "The 5 Forces That Shape Competitive Strategy." Now, Porter looked at strategy as being all about differentiation, and the fact that firms, from a strategy standpoint, in order to compete, needed to find a way to create sustainable competitive advantage. And really, this is analogous to Porter's really saying here they have to create some sort of a monopoly, have to create some sort of a barrier to entry. So you can see that he's taking the kind of point of view that in order to be successful from a strategy standpoint, he doesn't say this explicitly, but it's kind of implied by his paper, you have to create some sort of a monopoly. And I think we know that if you look at the market as a process, we realize that, number one, that's not as easy as it sounds, and number two, it's not really even necessary, because what happens in the market process is that consumers don't really make a choice between differentiated products or low-priced products. In a competitive marketplace where there are no barriers to entry and exit, you'll have competition. Low prices will dominate competitive markets, and then amongst the people who are able to be low cost and low price providers, they will also then differentiate or compete on differentiation. So in effect, consumers get both. They get what I call high value, meaning they get both low prices and differentiated products. And so the important thing to realize here is that even low levels of competition work. We get the benefits of more products and services at lower prices, even when you have low levels of competition. You don't have to have an infinite number of firms and completely identical products to have competition. As a matter of fact, you can have a small number of firms, or maybe even one firm. As long as there are no barriers to entry and exit, you'll get competition, and you'll get the benefits of competition. In Theodore Levitt's article, Marketing Myopia, he asked a very important question, which is, what business are you really in? And the lesson or from his article was that firms have to be very careful not to define their markets too narrowly. We can look at some examples of this in the past, and we'll do this now. So if you go back to the 1960s, when computing and computers were just starting to take over in many big companies and enterprises and governments, IBM had what at the time was considered a monopoly position in mainframe computers. They were very profitable, and they had a very, very high market share. And so IBM at the time was looked at as a monopoly and was actually sued by the Justice Department, by the Antitrust Division, for being a monopoly in 1969. That case took about 10 years or longer to work its way through the courts. And what happened in the interim? Well, the market changed from one of centralized computing to distributed computing. We saw the personal computer, including one made by IBM and, of course, Apple and Microsoft, and by in a matter of just 10 years, the entire marketplace has shifted away from big central computers to distributing computing, personal computing, and personal computing software, and that was really what was a driving force in the economy at that time. But even that didn't last. In less than another decade, we were into the era of internet computing, and the initial players in this space were Yahoo and Netscape and MySpace, and all of the energy and creativity and inertia in the marketplace was centered around this new internet technology. And very quickly, the initial players were replaced by yet another group of companies that quickly moved into the mobile computing space, in addition to the internet space, including Google and Apple and Amazon and Facebook. And these are kind of the dominant players that we know about today in both the technology industry and in the economy overall. And so, if we looked at any one point in time, from mainframe computing to distributed computing to internet computing to mobile computing, we would have made a judgment about market structure and the players that really over time changed. And so this is, in a sense, this is an example of Theodore Levitt's marketing myopia kind of playing out, the thing changing. But it's also a great example of how the market is a process. And we have to be, market structure theory is important for us to understand. It's a way for us to analyze markets, but we have to be careful that we don't forget the fact that the market is a process, and the positions of companies and the competition between companies will change over time. Now, we can look at a few other examples. We can look at an example of the railroads, which were a monopoly back at the turn of the 20th century. And the railroads kind of revolutionized, obviously, transportation of not only for people, but also for the transportation of goods and just about everything. It connected places that in the past were either hard to connect or not connected at all. And that lasted for probably 30, 40, or 50 years. But then came along airplanes, which was new technology, and that revolutionized the industry. So if we looked at it as just railroads, we would have seen one view of the market structure. But when we look at it from a longer term perspective, from a market process perspective, we'll start to see the world in terms of transportation. If we look at the telephone industry, back when Bell Telephone was the only telephone provider, it was a natural monopoly, and they provided really the telephone service that everyone relied upon for about 30, 40 years. But that industry also changed. And if we look at the industry in terms of communications, we saw the advent of mobile phones, of email, of faxes, pagings, many, many new ways to communicate. And so the telephone became just one of many, as opposed to only. So looking back, when there was just a telephone, it was easy to see Bell Telephone as a monopoly. When we look just a short period of time later, maybe a few decades, we have many, many other options for communicating. And if you look at today, making actual phone calls is probably very low down on the list in terms of the way that people communicate on an everyday basis. So we can look at the Dow Jones Industrial Average in 1979, and these are the 30 companies that made up the Dow Jones Industrial Average. The Dow Jones is the top 30 stocks that are representative of the United States economy. They're the biggest companies, the most powerful companies, and the ones that are meant to represent the breadth of the United States economy. It's interesting, if you look at this list, which is from 1979, there's no rhyme or reason for the year. I just picked a year, and you'd be hard-pressed to recognize any of these companies. Many of them are out of business. The few that you do recognize are a shell of what they used to be, including General Electric and Goodyear and Union Carbide. And then there's really just a few that are still on here. And so again, this is another illustration of the point that the market is a process that takes place through time. We have to be very careful we don't look at any one particular time as being overly definitive of the market. We have to realize that the market is a process. And that process is a process that is driven by competition, the fact that prices and profits are the things that coordinate resources in markets, and that the entrepreneur is the person or the function in markets that drives innovation. Now, the positions of firms is not fixed in time or place, and that's one of the important lessons that I'm trying to impart here, is that the competitive process will result in the players and the technologies and the products changing over time. And so really we have to look at monopoly as a temporary phenomenon. And as long as there are no barriers to entry and exit, then you're not going to have, then the competitive process will be allowed to work. And you'll find competitors entering and competing and coming up with new ideas, new business models, new products, and bringing us back to a situation that is largely competitive and dominated by competition. And the reason we're interested in there being competition as a norm in any market is because when you have competition, then we know the consumers are going to get the greatest amount of products at the lowest prices. And so it's important to remember the fact the market is a process, and when we're working on market structure theory, that we also remember that the market is a process and not put too much weight or significance on any one particular point in time, but realize that the market process plays out over time, and the competitive process plays out over time. And to really understand it, and to really understand companies, and to really understand competition, we have to look at it over a period of time.